Okay guys, so we're into our third session on the witches. In the first session I talked you through quite a lot of information about them. To recap them, in the second session I decided to write one 3-sentence paragraph summarising them and how they're presented using the GST structure. Today we're going to develop that into an analytical paragraph, so moving beyond just a summary to being analytical, which basically means an evidence-based paragraph, one that doesn't just summarise what we know about them and make some big sort of judgments about them, but to really engage with the evidence in the play. So the question we're answering is, how does Shakespeare present the witches as evil? So the first thing we need to do is to select a piece of textual evidence to write about, which will form the basis of this paragraph. So I've chosen the line, fair is foul and foul is fair. They say this in Act 1, Scene 1, at the end of that scene, and I think, it's a really interesting line for setting up some of the big ideas of the play. So I'm going to talk you through how to write an analytical paragraph about this line, and then I'm going to ask you to apply the same process. So you can obviously pause this, watch it as many times as you need to, but I should just sort of talk it through. So first of all, we always start by introducing our line, our piece of textual evidence, and hopefully by now you know I've got a little formula I use for that. I always start with the name of the character who said the line. So in this case it's the witches, followed by a comma. Then I always indicate when they say it. So at the end of Act 1, Scene 1, comma. Then I tell you who they say it to. The witches kind of say it in unison, so really they're saying it to the audience. So we can say that they say it together, or they, tell the audience. But I'm going to go with say together, and then I've got my line. Fair is foul and foul is fair. Fair is foul, comma, and foul is fair. So I've just used my who, when, who to sort of structure, modified a bit for this quotation, and I've introduced my line. The witches at the end of Act 1, Scene 1 say together, fair is foul and foul is fair. So then I need to use the word which, and I need to say something about it. Now normally I'd use the phrasing here, which leads the audience to infer. It's a bit more tricky here, isn't it? Because this is quite a kind of mysterious, slightly confusing phrase. So we might need to adapt what we say a little bit. So we'll say, which leads the audience to infer that the witches are mysterious figures who speak in riddles but seem to have an insight into human behaviour. So we maybe don't infer all that just from that line, but we can infer that they're a bit mysterious because they speak in this slightly riddly way. So it helps us to just build that general explanation. The witches at the end of Act 1, Scene 1 say together, fair is foul and foul is fair, which leads the audience to infer that the witches are mysterious figures who speak in riddles but seem to have an insight into human behaviour. So now I need to be more specific. I need to zoom in on some of the words, and I need to think about how these words relate to evil. So I always start my second sentence with in particular, because that then shows it's going to focus in and say more. So in particular, and when two words are put together for effect, we call it juxtaposition. And it's good to use technical language to sound academic. So I would say the juxtaposition of the contrasting words fair and foul is interesting. So that obviously now I need to explain why it's interesting. It's not enough to just say it's interesting, is it? Because Shakespeare seems to be signalling that these two things are the same, that one is the other, because Shakespeare seems to suggest that they are one and the same thing. This seems to suggest that good and evil exist together and can be indistinguishable from each other. Now, indistinguishable just means you can't tell them apart. So this is these. Okay, so it's quite complex ideas we're writing about. So let's have a check of what we've got. The witches at the end of Act 1, Scene 1 say together, fair is foul and foul is fair, which leads the audience to infer that the witches are mysterious figures who speak in riddles, but seem to have an insight in human behaviour. In particular, the juxtaposition of the contrasting words foul and fair is interesting, because Shakespeare seems to suggest that they are one and the same thing. This seems to suggest that good and evil exist together and can be indistinguishable from each other. Okay, I'm generally happy about that. Fair represents good, foul represents evil, they're one and the same thing. So I've said something more specific, a couple of sentences specifically about word choice. So now I'm going to try and use my thesis sentence to say my big, or my thematic sentence if you like, my big idea of what Shakespeare was saying to show. So it seems that Shakespeare uses this line in order to introduce, because it's at the beginning of the play, isn't it, the idea that good and evil coexist within human nature. So although this isn't clear at this moment, this will become a big theme later. And obviously the nature of evil will become interesting. So I just want to anchor that back to my question. How does Shakespeare present the witches as evil? Well, it seems here, doesn't it, that perhaps the witches aren't evil. That perhaps the witches are symbolic of the evil that lies within human nature. So I'm going to add a second sentence to develop that. So I'm going to say here, perhaps, and again I'm being tentative because I don't know, Shakespeare was using the anxieties of his age and the fears of witchcraft to create a powerful symbol on the stage. And now I need to explain what I mean by that because it's a bit obscure, isn't it? In this sense, they are not evil, but symbols of the evil that exists within human nature, that sits outside of our understanding. So hopefully I've explained myself a bit clearer there. So the witches at the end of Act 1, Scene 1 say together, fair is foul and foul is fair, which leads the audience to infer that the witches are mysterious figures who speak in riddles, but seem to have an insight into human behaviour. In particular, the juxtaposition of the contrasting words fair and foul is interesting, because Shakespeare seems to suggest that they are one and the same thing. This seems to suggest that good and evil exist together and can be indistinguishable from each other. It seems that Shakespeare uses the line in order to introduce the idea that good and evil coexist within human nature. Perhaps Shakespeare was using the anxieties of his age and the fears of witchcraft to create a powerful symbol on the stage. In this sense, they are not evil, but symbols of the evil that exists within human nature, but sits outside of our understanding. Now, there's bits of that aren't perfect, and I could go back and change a few bits and bobs, repetition of words, whatever. But I think fundamentally I've built up an analysis. I've started with that general explanation that the witches are mysterious. I haven't said anything particularly in-depth or clever. I've then tried to explain the words and how putting them next to each other suggests that good and evil sit side by side. And then obviously I finish by trying to go bigger, to think about what are the big themes that Shakespeare was showing and how does this relate to the world Shakespeare knew. So what I'd like you to have a go at is choose any line from the play that relates to the witches and write your own analytical paragraph. Using mine as a model, starting with a line from the play, trying to say something quite general about that line and what it shows about the witches. Try and say something more specific about some of the words and why you think that word is important. And then most importantly at the end, anchoring back to our question. How does that line relate to the concept of evil? So that you're not just writing about the witches, but also about evil in the play. Okay, as always, email your teachers if you're stuck. If you produce a paragraph you'd like checked, please send it to your teacher and we'll have a little look at it. It should, take you a little while. You can write back more than one line. The more practice you get, the better. But for now, that's the end of this session.